The Russian lower house of parliament has given its definitive approval to constitutional changes that allow Vladimir Putin to run for president again in 2024, something the current constitution forbids. The 450-seat State Duma, the lower house of parliament, on Wednesday voted in favor of the changes in a third and final reading by 383 votes.
Well, nobody voted against, but 43 lawmakers abstained. 24 lawmakers were absent. 67-year-old Putin, who has dominated Russia's political landscape for 2 decades now as either president or prime minister, has made a dramatic appearance in the lower chamber a day earlier to argue that term limits were less important in times of crisis.
Putin told Parliament in televised comments on Tuesday he believed a constitutional amendment that would allow him to run for president again could be adopted if Russia's constitutional court did not object. The amendments to the constitution will be put to a national vote on April the 22nd. Putin is required by the constitution to step down in the year 2024 when his second sequential presidential term ends. For more on the story, we are now joined via Skype from Moscow, Russia, by Konstantin Syomin, a Russian journalist and commentator. Konstantin, good evening and thank you for joining us on The Globe.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for having me.
Now, Konstantin, is he staying on in power for some sort of agenda? Why run again and not make room for other contenders?
It's not something that aroused recently. It's not an easy question to answer, actually, because what's happening throughout the recent month in Russia is holding many people puzzled here, including myself. But still, it's not something completely new. And Vladimir Putin, although he is known for his ability to surprise the elites and the population in general, I think that this time he overpassed himself. The problem of the so-called transition of power in Russia is something that we're dealing here since 1991, at least, when Boris Yeltsin was looking for a successor when his health was ailing. Our oligarchs, our people in power, were also guessing who will be his pick, who will be his candidate. And then, surprisingly, nobody knew Putin back then. And Putin became the person Yeltsin made his successor. And first, he was appointed as a prime minister. And in 2007, Putin himself had to play out the same card. He was looking for a successor. He handpicked Dmitry Medvedev, the next prime minister, and then they switched their seats. They called this a tandem and then a democracy, which lasted for like 8 years. That helped them to avoid the norm in constitution that prevented anybody to run for president for more than 2 sequential terms. So after Medvedev left, Putin was good to go again, and he had another 2 terms. And then they extended each term for 6 years. So once we are approaching to 2024, when he will be constitutionally unable to submit his bid again. The power people in the Kremlin are looking now for a scenario that would let them to avoid this contradiction. So up until recently, in February, most of the people, most of the media here were thinking that we are about to change our political system dramatically, because in February, Putin had addressed the parliament and suggested that we should change the constitution so that another body, constitutional body, the Constitutional Council, appears and gains a new power, new strength, and that would presumably led him to step aside. Nobody actually knew what would be his potential role in such a system. So everybody were getting ready for the new parliamentary elections. There were new parties registered, new politicians, new political faces coming up to the surface. And then suddenly, at the beginning of this week, he shows up at the parliament, and the parliament requests his consent for running again for the God knows what time. and he accepts this proposition, which was a total shock for many people in the State Duma, and aside from it, what you mentioned in the beginning, why the majority of the parliamentaries did support this idea, I think is quite understandable to anybody who lives in Russia and is witnessing the development of the political system here. Most of the parliament is in a way controlled or manipulated by the presidential administration, and the 40-something deputies who abstained from the vote are the members of the Russian Communist Party, who are not really in opposition, but sometimes are still risking to say something against and be the real opposition in parliament.
Now,
so basically,
Konstantin, the lawmakers have approved the amendments in parliament. Now it moves to the regional parliaments, where they still need to have votes on that, and then from the regional parliament it then becomes the public's decision. With all of this and the protests taking place, what's likely to happen?
I don't think that there's, at least at this point, because we are witnessing the beginning of the new era of turbulence, not only in the world in general, but in Russia in particular, because Russia is badly hurt, is badly hit by the current downfall of the oil prices, of the market prices everywhere. So this may change everything dramatically in the coming days or months. But so far, I don't think that either the vote, which is scheduled for April 22nd, or the decision-making of the regional parliaments may in any way affect this process, because all the regional parliaments are also under control. They are not able to do anything serious without making it in line with the official line of the Kremlin. And the population, it is split. Because of the economic crisis, because of the depression which we are living through now, there's the growing amount of disappointed, disenfranchised people within the lower layers of society. But still, I would say Putin is still enjoying a very reasonable support of the population. And if the whole package of amendments, constitutional amendments would be put to vote, say tomorrow, in a week, or even in a month, I think he has still very high chances to push it through. But there's no guarantee that the situation won't change by the time when people will be voting in April. So everything is very flexible. But at the same time, he's using the very same agenda, the very same justification for the whole change of course. He's saying that because we're entering very, very unstable times, very stormy waters, the country needs to have a strong leader. The country needs to be governed predictably. And that's why he cannot leave Russia in times of change, in times of turbulence.
Now, critics say he has too many enemies, and in the same breath, too many cronies who depend on him and who will want him to remain in power. Is this the case?
I think it is very close to reality. There is definitely a competition within the power circle because at some point or another, Putin would have to step aside and he would have to name his successor. There will be a successor anyway. And there are powerful cliques, powerful camps within the Kremlin. Most of them are affiliated with different oligarchic structures. And they are evidently, they are getting themselves prepared to such a period. But at the same time, there are people whose political perspectives, whose political careers are attached to Putin personally, and they definitely do not want him go. I think they are very powerful. They are controlling very powerful ministries, very powerful sectors of the Russian government, and they are in position. They are totally capable of influencing, of making an influence upon his decisions. I think, and many people think in such way here too, too that they were behind his unexpected appearance before the State Duma at the beginning of this week.
Now, Konstantin, looking at the impact in terms of Putin remaining in power, as always, Putin always wins. What would be the impact on a post-Russia without Putin for international relations? Looking at the US, looking at China, looking at the EU, is this even a possibility with regards to relations going forward?
I think that everything depends on the situation in the global economy and in the Russian economy in particular. If the oil prices are stabilized and things are getting back to normal in Russia, I think that they will be able to arrange a sort of succession scheme that may let Russia to follow the same track that Putin had formulated in the past. If we are in fact witnessing the beginning of the real turbulence, I think that anything may change. And I don't think that it is limited to Russia alone. I don't think that there's anybody now who is able to predict the political course, the trajectory of events for either Russia or Europe or the United States. So it totally depends on the economy now and on the development of the coronavirus crisis.
And if he remains in power until the year 2036, what does this mean going forward for the people on the streets, the people on the ground in Russia? And as you say, he still has a lot of support. But, you know, with protests taking place already before the vote that is expected to take place on the 22nd of April, what does this mean for people on the ground?
At this point, I don't think that we should overestimate the importance of the protest. There's still a very marginal proportion of population who is willing to take part in the protests. Even last year, when Putin and his administration pushed forward with their pension reform and they raised the age of retirement, it was perceived very badly among the population. There were many long-time Putin supporters who called themselves completely disappointed, and they turned away from him. But it didn't change anything significantly. So I think in the midterm perspective, he's very confident and he is going to stay in control. But as time goes by, I can tell you, like from my conversations with people around me, with other journalists, with people in the politics as well, I can tell you that like 90% of them were caught by surprise, and they were very, very negatively surprised. They were disappointed because you wouldn't expect to live in the country run by one and the same person for like 30 years. Plus, the whole political class, which was brought to power by Putin, mostly they're people of the same age. They are in their 60s and their 70s. They're not getting younger. By 2024, they won't get younger in any case. And this is something that troubles the relations between the Russian government and the younger generation of Russians, the people who are now in their 15s, 16s, 20-something. And they're getting older and they're very extremely, like 100% disappointed. They're very, very, very frustrated with the course, with the direction that the government is taking and the country is taking.
Konstantin, thank you so much for joining us this evening on The Globe. That is Konstantin Suyomin, and he is a Russian journalist and commentator, and he was joining us via Skype from Moscow in Russia.